Welcome. This session is an opportunity to discuss the lessons learned accelerating the rollout of 5G in the West Midlands with the West Midlands 5G's Infrastructure Acceleration Team. So first things first, let me introduce you to the team and the panellists that we have with us today. So we have Rhys Enfield, he's our Director of Infrastructure Acceleration. We have Judith Ferrarin, who's our Project Manager, Infrastructure Acceleration. Dave Kinshot, a consultant in that area, and Rick Riley, our barrier busting consultant. Now, I think we'll find that working collaboratively has proven to be a key element to the success in this area and in the region. So let's find out a little bit more about this from the team, and particularly, I think what we want to focus it on is their findings from a local authority perspective. A little bit of context first, I think, will be helpful. So I'm going to go to Rhys. What has been the kind of role of your team, and secondly, why is ensuring 5G readiness a priority?
Oh, hi, Leslie. I'd firstly say West Midlands 5G's mission is to accelerate the deployment of 5G networks and also test, prove and scale new 5G services across the West Midlands. The explicit remit of the Infrastructure Acceleration Team is to accelerate 5G, and we do this by facilitating relationships between operators and local councils, trying to understand both parties' motivations and obligations, and then working with them to find common ground that is also aligned to the Electronic Communications Code, the National Planning Policy Framework, and the Future Telecoms Infrastructure Review. As this session's about West Midlands 5G and how we are working with councils, I think it's important to emphasise that one of the key aspects of our role has been to be an honest broker or trusted advisor to both parties. And it's not just about saying this. At a recent panel session at 5G World, we were delighted to be joined by both Wolverhampton City Council and both Coventry City Council, who were clear that collaborating with West Midlands 5G enabled significant progress and supported the development of relationships, all of which has hastened the rollout of 5G. 5G readiness is important for the region and the UK, as the UK was the 5th country to launch 5G, hence obtaining an early mover advantage. To exploit this advantage, mobile operators need to continue the rollout of 5G networks quickly and efficiently. This way, they can start to build services and applications that will start to drive both social and economic benefits for the region and also nationally.
And from your experience in the region, how have councils, or indeed how do councils, enable themselves to be 5G ready?
Well, as West Midlands 5G, we are in a privileged position of being able to not only support the local councils, but also work with both mobile operators and infrastructure providers to remove barriers in the two key areas of the Electronic Communications Code and Town and Country Planning, helping to overcome issues and turn what were often confrontational relationships into collaborative ones. We've also worked with industry to develop solutions for small cell deployment and created a connected map to allow operators easy access to public assets such as council land and buildings. And I'd also say, from our experience, local councils need to be clear on their connectivity priorities, and this ultimately comes from the leadership within the council. A clear mandate to drive connectivity rolls down the organisation, and that in turn helps to engage those who can work with operators to speed up the deployment of 5G.
So in relation to the legislation that you mentioned and linked to the Future Telecoms Infrastructure Review, do councils have that clear mandate in relation to the recommendations, and are they clear on the actions that are needed? And perhaps importantly, how can you expand on perhaps how you've enabled this?
Well, within the West Midlands, M5G has worked with all the 7 constituent members of the West Midlands Combined Authority to establish both digital champions and coordinators to assess the barriers to 5G deployment. it's a very good point, and the size and scale of councils varies dramatically. So we've put some fundamental building blocks in place to help us and the operators work in the most efficient way. One of the first tasks was to work with councils to put digital champions and coordinators in place. And these were the people who knew the internal workings of their councils and could help get things done. Prior to this, time was often wasted chasing around trying to find the right contact within the council. So the second thing we did was also to form a 5G digital forum where all the champions and coordinators are represented. This forum's used to basically share knowledge and gain learnings, not just about accelerating 5G rollout, but also about the wider 5G programme and the benefits that it can bring.
Okay, moving on to something else, Rhys. You mentioned earlier about the creation of a connected map. So I'm going to direct this question to Dave, actually, if I may, who's led this area for West Midlands 5G. Firstly, Dave, what is the aim of the map?
Sure, thanks, Leslie. So when we originally proposed the connected map, the aim was to collate as many inputs as possible to understand the level of connectivity, but more importantly, the gaps within the West Midlands region. We then plan to use that data to identify the areas of concern and propose solutions or site locations to assist operators in closing the gaps. But as the map has developed and we progress through the process, it's now a very invaluable tool that shows both fibre and mobile operator connectivity in the region, and it allows a comparison against the local authority and mobile operator priorities. So the slide you can see in the background gives an overview of some of the data that we've collected and the problems that we're trying to solve. So this particular example shows an operator not spot in red, and it's in Birmingham, and it intersects a train line, as you can see in grey and red running through the middle, but it's also very close to a main road in blue and other areas of importance such as new houses and housing. So we can see that there are several public sector land assets in yellow in this example that might offer a solution to fill that gap. So our aim is to be as proactive as possible and give the operator options to improve their coverage. Having this data readily available allows the conversations to commence collaboratively.
Interesting. You talked about value, but I think I'd like to know a little bit more about the value, particularly from a local authority and also an operator's perspective. And perhaps, if you could, give an example of perhaps the map in action.
Yeah, of course. So firstly, from a local authority perspective, the map can be used to give an overview of mobile and fibre coverage throughout the region, both at a region-wide level, but also right down to street level. So we can even zoom in on a particular road or property and give an overview of what the coverage is like. If I give you a couple of recent examples where this has been useful, we've done a review of the Commonwealth Games 2022 sites, the proposed venues that require coverage, and we've been able to understand what our gaps are and start looking at it. And secondly, we've looked at some new housing estates in the region where fibre cannot reasonably be made available, and we've been able to offer 5G as an alternative because we can see it's on the map. So secondly, to answer your question from an MNO perspective, we've mapped over 400,000 public assets and made them available as potential candidates for macrocell sites, small cells, or even anchor tenancy candidates where we're proposing a fibre proposition. Having this data available with a clear process in place and code agreements offers operators a quick and collaborative solution for new sites. So a recent example of this, we've been approached by a tower company that's using the map about a new 5G site in Wolverhampton that they have identified. We were able to take that site and move it through the process to full design in around 2 months, which is considerably quicker than standard process.
Interesting. And I know, I was speaking to Coventry recently, actually, they were very keen to emphasise that the mapping of the existing infrastructure has been crucial, really providing a strong asset for the region in terms of what they've got, but importantly, what they haven't got. So I recognise it's important for the region. Is this something that could be rolled out nationally, do you think?
Yeah, well, feedback so far has been very, very positive, and we continue to trial the map with various stakeholders to make improvements as we go. So we believe it would be very beneficial to roll out a similar solution nationally. And indeed, we've started looking at how that could be achieved. But it's also worth noting that it's very important that the map shouldn't be rolled out in isolation. it's equal as important that we have the local authorities and other public sector asset owners fully supportive of the process and keen to work collaboratively. So we need barrier busting and code agreements in parallel so that access to the assets is swift and fair from a commercial perspective.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to move to the electronic communications code now. And I know Judith, who is with us, has worked closely with councils in relation to the code. So I welcome your view on their level of awareness and perhaps a little update on progress on ongoing property negotiations, Judith.
Well, we realised that the local authorities lacked an understanding of the code and they had no chance of keeping up with the upper tribunal decisions. They were also threatened with a huge reduction in their income, and they seemed to lack the understanding and appreciation that the income was also outweighed by the socio and economic benefits. At the times, the local authorities have been under pressure as well to agree new agreements and lease renewals, and they were threatened with possible court action as well.
So a very difficult landscape for local authorities. It would be good to know, what have you done and what has the team done to help local councils?
Well, we've prepared a 1 or 2 page synopsis in the form of a leaflet of upper tribunal decisions, which was prepared in everyday language on the electronic communications code. And we ensured that we didn't add any of our own opinions, so we could maintain a completely neutral position. We've had initial involvement and interventions with the councils as they came onto our radar to get them and the infrastructure providers engaged, moving towards a collaborative relationship. We've been working alongside the mobile network operators, the wireless infrastructure providers and the neutral hosts, and we've mapped out a rollout process, and the typical corresponding council activities were then overlaid, and each council one by one were then tailored their resource and costs above that, so that was mapped into there. We worked together with the councils and the wireless infrastructure providers, etc., and we facilitated to create a rationale by mapping out a 10-year costs to arrive at an all-inclusive annual figure. Then that was calculated to provide an annual figure, which is payable to the local authorities. We looked at the Greater London Authority template agreement and adopted it as a preferential route for the West Midlands councils. And we have 4 of the councils are actually in the process of adopting the template with only minor amendments. And finally, we've also found that direct engagements, principally between the councils and their operators, is far more fruitful than the traditional route using agents and contractors.
Interesting. Moving to another piece of legislation, the National Planning Policy Framework. Rick, moving to you now, if I may. Town planners, planning committees, are they conversant and important adherent to this legislation?
Perhaps in contrast to the code, local authorities are thoroughly conversant with planning law, but planning law itself is far from definitive, requiring planning officers and planning committees to weigh visual impact against the benefits to individuals and communities. The relatively new National Planning Policy Framework, issued last year, requires planners to view mobile infrastructure as a strategic necessity, and its guidance is clear that planning policies and decisions should support the expansion of electronic communications networks, including next generation mobile technology such as 5G. And in all cases, improved communications should be weighed against any visual impacts. We work with our councils and the industry to share their perspectives and find the necessary balance that will enable technology and services to be delivered to the public and communities while considering concerns and suggestions from individuals.
So if councils have a good understanding of this aspect of legislation, what's the role of West Midlands 5G?
Our role is really one of facilitation and clarification. It's included meeting with the councils to look at the National Planning Policy Framework and the Permitted Development Right frame legislation, and look how their own attitudes and adherence meets it. We've also prepared leaflets on the planning policy framework and the permitted development rights, written as our other leaflets are in everyday speak. And this is to try and help everybody understand some fairly tricky legislation. After that, operator meetings are arranged and they're facilitated with planning officers as well as planning committees, a meeting of minds, if you were, with a common goal, but quite often different circumstances. We're then helping to ensure that pre-consultation and collaboration are the norm. They're encouraged and they're redoubled, as well as ensuring that the operators in particular adhere to an earlier code of practice in terms of pre-consultation and the level of detail that they provide. Essential to ensuring that the number of rejections is minimised is continuous dialogue between the industry and our councils, and where perhaps things are controversial or contentious, that this dialogue delivers the necessary compromise.
What I've heard in this debate is a key theme, I think, one of collaboration and building relationships. So I've got one last question now, and I'm going to go back to Rhys on this one, if I may. What is the key enabler, and can you share one key lesson learned with us?
Okay, so I would say it's not only one ingredient, but three key ingredients. So cooperation, conversation, and collaboration. Key to our success has been to act as a facilitator between the different parties, engendering a philosophy of collaboration. To this mix, we then bring together expertise across from many areas, including industry networks, local authority know-how, and also planning proficiency. This has allowed West Midlands 5G to make great strides barrier busting, cutting through much of the red tape, but alongside the reality of budget cuts, skills shortages, and the limited autonomy that our local authorities have to tackle on a daily basis. We work closely with the digital champions, the coordinators, and other key stakeholders at all our 7 councils. We continuously reviewing and refining our approach.
Lovely, thank you. And I think our time is coming to an end. So I think it's been an interesting and informative discussion. So just to thank you all for sharing your experience today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.